Have you ever stopped to think that those ancient objects, now hidden behind museum displays, hold secrets capable of changing the way we see the world? It seems exaggerated, but it's not. The artisans of ancient Egypt weren't just manual laborers, they were the true architects of eternity. While pharaohs were forgotten and empires fell, their anonymous hands left marks that still dictate what we consider beautiful, grand, and even sacred. Curious, isn't it? We tend to believe that power comes only from kings. But what if I told you that it was the artisans who truly kept Egypt alive for millennia? They transformed stone into memory, metal into power, and faith into. And if you pay attention, you'll realize that much of what they created still influences your life today, even if you've never noticed. So, before we dive into this journey, I want to extend an invitation. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is now. It'll be incredible to see where this knowledge will travel, connecting us in real time, just as Egyptian artifacts connected generations through the centuries. He would wake early, even before the sun painted the banks of the Nile gold. The sound of the first voices in the market and the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakeries announced the beginning of a new day. There stood the Egyptian artisan, an ordinary man, but one who possessed in his hands the rare skill of shaping stone, wood, or metal. He was not noble, but neither was he a servant. He occupied a curious space, a sort of intermediate class that sustained both the pharaoh's luxury and the daily needs of the population. As he walked through the dusty streets, many greeted him with restrained respect. He wasn't treated with reverence like a priest, but neither was he ignored. After all, it was his hands that shaped the statues of the gods, the protective amulets, and the vases that held rare perfume. It's interesting to think about this. Today, when someone makes handicrafts and sells them at a market, they might receive only fleeting glances. In Egypt, the artisan was recognized as someone who kept alive the connection between humans and divinity. Upon arriving at his workshop, the smell of freshly cut wood mingled with the limestone dust. The rhythmic sound of the chisel striking the surface echoed like a repetitive, almost hypnotic melody. If you think about it, it's not so different from those who spend hours typing on a keyboard or editing a video on a computer today. Every era has its own work music, and for them, this constant tapping was the soundtrack to their daily routine. But there was also a contradiction. Despite the importance of his role, the artisan did not enjoy the luxuries he produced. Imagine a man who creates vases adorned with gold, but at home stores water in simple clay containers. This duality is very reminiscent of the modern world, where many people produce cutting-edge technology but, upon returning home, live simply, sometimes without even enjoying what they helped create. It was a life of discipline and patience. The artisan knew his work could last days, weeks, or even months. Those who observe Egyptian sculptures today, with their ancient perfection, can hardly imagine the backaches, the calloused hands, and the suffocating heat of the workshop. If today we complain about spending hours in traffic or stuck in endless meetings, it's worth remembering that back then the routine was also marked by exhausting repetition, only under even harsher conditions. And so the day went on, amidst the quiet admiration of the people and the demands of the elite. The artisan carried within him a kind of silent power. He didn't govern, he didn't wage war, he didn't preach sermons, but he built what endured. In a way, this social role, neither too high nor too low, already paved the way for something even more fascinating about the lives of these men, the profound influence of religion on their. The craftsman began his day with a silent prayer, gazing at the horizon where the sun was rising, as if it were the god Ra himself crossing the sky. Religion wasn't just a distant belief, it was part of the very air he breathed. Every stroke of the chisel, every stroke of the wood, carried the intention of honoring deities who, it was believed, could decide one's fate. Today, when someone wears a cross around their neck or lights a candle at home, it is a gesture of faith. For the Egyptian, this gesture was transformed into solid, tangible art that would span centuries. The workshop walls were filled with images of gods. Horus, with his piercing falcon-like gaze, protective Isis, Osiris as lord of the afterlife. The artisans saw them not as mere symbols, but as living presences that demanded respect. Just as many people today say, I have to do it right because God is watching, he believed that every detail of the sculpture could be a channel of communication with the sacred. A mistake, no matter how small, was not just a technical flaw, it was a lack of devotion. The smell of burning incense in the temple mingled with that of sun-warmed stone. With each delivery of a sacred piece, the artisan felt something greater than the simple payment in grain or copper. It was as if participating in a divine theater, in which their role was to give flesh to the immortals. And isn't that curious? Today, when someone sets up a Christmas nativity scene or paints a saint's image, they repeat this same logic, bringing into the physical world that which is spiritual. Interestingly, this connection to religion also carried a heavy responsibility. After all, a pharaoh could demand that a god's statue be as grand as his own. It wasn't just about art, but also about politics and power. The artisan was, in a way, playing a game where faith and authority were intertwined. It's like when a company hires someone to design its brand, it's not just about aesthetics, it's about identity. It's about symbolic dominance. Many artisans passed these stories on to their children as they worked. Imagine a father carving the face of Anubis and saying, "See, my son, here is the guardian of the dead. He is the one who decides the passage of souls." This silent pedagogy shaped generations. Today, we might explain the world to children by showing them a science book or telling stories from the Bible. Back then, the lesson came in the form of carved stone, gold, or wood. And as the afternoon wore on, the artisan felt that his fatigue wasn't just, it was as if he carried the weight of his people's religion on his shoulders. Faith was his inspiration, but also his obligation. And this, in a way, paved the way for another issue that would profoundly mark his career: the demanding patronage of the pharaohs and the elite, who constantly sought luxury and imposed new challenges. By dawn, the artisan already knew he wasn't working just for himself or his family. The watchful eye of the scribes, sent by the pharaoh, constantly reminded him that every detail mattered. The elite's patronage wasn't just a blessing, it was also a silent and constant pressure. It's like when someone receives a scholarship today, there's gratitude, yes, but also the pressure to live up to expectations. Inside the workshops, the atmosphere was a mix of honor and tension. Producing for the elite meant access to noble materials, such as gold and rare stones, that most would never touch. Imagine the contrast. At home, the artisan drank water from simple clay jugs, but at work he fashioned pure alabaster vases to adorn royal salons. This chasm between personal and professional life is something we still feel today when someone drives a simple car but works designing luxury automobiles. Patronage also offered prestige. A craftsman recognized by the pharaohs could have his name inscribed on documents, a form of immortality rare for people of his class. However, this same prestige carried the risk of punishment. A poorly made piece could cost not only one's job but also one's life. It's like in the modern world, big contracts bring big responsibilities, and a mistake can mean losing everything overnight. There was also the detail of aesthetic demands. The pharaoh didn't just want a sculpture, he wanted a reflection of his grandeur, a symbol of eternity. This made each work nearly impossible. The artisan needed to follow strict standards, but also create something unique. It's as if someone today asked, make a logo that's the same as everyone else's, but at the same time different from everyone else's. It seems contradictory, but that was the expectation. As his calloused hands shaped the objects, his mind wandered to life's ironies. After all, behind the glory of the pyramids, temples, and palaces lay anonymous sweat. The artisan was an invisible link in this chain of power. He didn't feel like he owned what he created, merely a messenger of the elite's will. This feeling of being needed, but never truly free, is similar to that of many professionals today who work in giant companies and never see their name on the facade. And at the end of the day, when the last piece was handed over to the scribe who recorded everything, a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation remained. The artisan knew his work upheld the pharaoh's image of eternity, but there was also an intriguing question. Where did all these magnificent materials he manipulated come from? It was the beginning of another dimension of his craft, the use and mastery of natural resources, such as limestone, granite, and basalt. The artisan's day almost always began with the weight of stones. Limestone, granite, and basalt weren't just inert blocks. They were his companions on his journey. The raw materials of his limestone, softer, allowed for delicate details, while granite, hard and imposing, required extra strength and patience. Basalt, dark and resistant, carried with it an aura of mystery. Today, when someone talks about choosing the right material for the job, they might not imagine that in Egypt, this could have been a matter of months of sweat, more or less. As he walked to the quarry, the sound of hammers echoed like constant thunder. The smell of dust clung to his clothes, and his skin burned under the merciless sun, yet there was a strange satisfaction in touching those ancient stones. It was as if each one already held within itself the form it was meant to take. This perception is very reminiscent of the work of a modern sculptor who looks at a block of marble and says, "The statue is already there, I just need to free it." The Egyptian craftsman possessed a silent wisdom regarding these stones. He knew which would withstand the test of time, which would best capture sunlight in temples, which would convey grandeur. We can apply this same logic to our everyday choices. It's not just what we do, but also what we do with. Choosing the right materials, partners, or tools can be the difference between something that lasts only a short time and something that lasts for generations. Imagine a craftsman explaining to his apprentice, "Limestone obeys us but wears easily. Granite challenges us but guarantees eternity." These phrases could easily be life advice. What comes easily doesn't always last, and what requires effort often has lasting value. It's curious how practical lessons of the trade still resonate in modern life, even when we've traded chisels for keyboards. At the end of the day, the transformed stones carried a greater symbolism. Granite wasn't just granite, it was the pharaoh's eternity. Basalt wasn't just basalt, it was the unwavering gaze of a god. Limestone, though simpler, served the purpose of recording everyday scenes and reliefs that today tell us entire stories. The artisan, even if unaware of it, was creating a link between his reality and ours, thousands of years later. And as he organized his tools, he already thought about materials that came not only from the hard earth, but also from nature's most precious veins. For if stone supported temples and statues, it was noble metals like gold and silver that brought shine and luxury to the objects of the elite. At dawn, the sun's glow reflected off the golden grains mixed with the desert sand. For the artisan, gold was not just metal, it was the very skin of the god. When he received a small piece of this material in his workshop, he treated it almost like a living being, with care, devotion, and even a certain trepidation. Unlike rough stone, gold seemed to have a will of its own, malleable and at the same time powerful. Today, we might think of gold as an investment or jewelry, but for them it was a symbol of eternity. The process was slow, almost ritualistic. The sound of the hammer gently striking the metal echoed like a heart. The heat of the fire melted the fragments, while the metallic smell filled the workshop air. The artisan fashioned rings, bracelets, and necklaces he would never wear but which would adorn kings and queens. It's similar to someone who works today creating haute couture clothing without ever wearing it, producing luxury for others while maintaining a simple life. Silver, in turn, had a curious value. It wasn't as abundant in Egypt as gold, which made each piece even more special. The craftsman knew that when he worked with silver, he was handling something rarer, often imported. This detail already shows how Egypt was connected to other peoples, exchanging wealth and technique. Just as today we depend on imported goods for certain comforts, they too had their own particular globalization. Working with precious metals brought an ambiguous feeling. There was pride in manipulating something so coveted but also an almost painful The artisan created necklaces inlaid with lapis lazuli, but at home he used simple linen thread. This discrepancy recalls the life of a renowned chef who prepares expensive dishes for millionaire clients, but who, upon returning home, heats up ordinary soup for himself. And, despite their economic value, gold and silver carried a spiritual weight. They weren't just adornments, but amulets, talismans, symbols of protection. Craftsmen believed that by shaping these metals, they were collaborating with the balance between men and gods. Every detail, every curve, was a silent prayer in the form of an object. To this day, when someone wears a gold ring, perhaps unknowingly, they relive this same symbolism of eternity and commitment. As the day drew to a close and the pieces gleamed in the torchlight, the artisan realized that richness lay not only in the metals. There was also something fascinating in simpler materials, like wood, which, with talent and patience, could be transformed into true masterpieces. The craftsman would begin his day smelling the freshly cut wood, an aroma that mingled with the fine dust of the workshop. Unlike stone and metal, wood held a certain intimacy, almost as if it had a soul. It was lighter, closer to everyday life, yet still carried a tremendous responsibility. Each chip removed by the chisel revealed a hidden detail, and it was through this patient process that elegant furniture and small devotional statues were born. The sound of carving was different from that of stone, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. The craftsman felt that, with each stroke, he was getting closer to the final result. It was as if he were conversing with the wood, asking permission to reveal its form. Today, carpenters often describe this sensation as therapeutic. Time seems to slow down, and every detail demands their full presence. Perhaps this is why, to this day, wood is associated with comfort and human warmth. Furniture such as beds, chairs, and boxes were delicately carved, often decorated with ivory or stone inlays. But there were also small statues which carried enormous spiritual significance. Imagine an ordinary family receiving a small figurine of a god from a craftsman to protect their home. This is very similar to someone today placing an image of a saint in their bedroom or a mandala on the wall, discrete symbols that bring a sense of security. Techniques were passed down from father to son, almost like family secrets. The craftsman knew the right angle, the exact pressure, the right moment to stop. One false move could ruin days of work. This discipline is very reminiscent of a musician practicing scales or a programmer reviewing lines of code. Small repetitions that combined create magnificent works. Essentially, every craft that requires dedication has this same rhythm of patience. And there was also the aesthetic side. Wood carving wasn't just functional, it was an opportunity to showcase beauty and creativity. The craftsman could transform a simple chair into an object worthy of a pharaoh. This care teaches us something even in seemingly simple tasks.
there's room for elegance. Just as today someone might transform an ordinary notebook into a bullet journal, stylish journal, the craftsman turned the utility vehicle into a work of art. As night fell, amid the scent of resin and the distant sounds of the market, the artisan put away his tools. He knew that the next day he would face another challenge, working not with wood or stone but with the delicate alabaster used to create vases whose translucency still enchants. Early in the morning, when the breeze was still cool on the banks of the Nile, the artisan could already feel the smooth coolness of alabaster between his hands. This material was unlike ordinary stone. It had a translucency that allowed light to pass through gently, almost as if it glowed from within. Shaping alabaster was a delicate task, requiring patience and control because a sudden movement could crack the entire piece. Today, when we see illuminated lamps or frosted glass objects, we feel something similar, the beauty that comes from light filtering through the material. In the workshops, the sound was more muted than when working granite. Instead of loud knocks, there were soft scrapings, a continuous friction reminiscent of someone sanding wood. The faintly mineral smell permeated the room. The artisan spent hours, days, perhaps weeks to complete a single, and it wasn't just any vase. These containers were used to store rare perfumes, medicinal oils, or sacred ointments. Imagine today spending months creating a package, but a package that in itself was already a treasure. Alabaster held prestige among the elite because it represented delicacy and sophistication. It wasn't just a container, but a status symbol, just as someone today flaunts a luxury watch or an imported car. In ancient Egypt, owning an alabaster vase demonstrated power and good taste. The artisan, even far removed from this life of ostentation, was the one who made this silent display of wealth possible. For the apprentice, working with alabaster was almost a rite of passage. The master would say, if you can sculpt without breaking, then you're ready to tackle even more challenging materials. This logic holds true today in various fields. Those who learn to handle the difficult gain the confidence to tackle the impossible. It's like learning to write well on paper before venturing into writing an entire book. Each skill prepares the next. Interestingly, alabaster also had a spiritual role. Many vases were left in tombs to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. This reinforced the idea that the material held more than just perfume. It held promises of eternity. The artisan, when polishing the surface until it became translucent, may not have realized he was building a symbolic bridge between the present and the afterlife. And as he closed the day, watching the piece gleam in the torchlight, he knew the craft required more than technique. It required sensitivity, a sensitivity that also manifested itself in another fundamental aspect of the craft, the creation of jewelry inlaid with semi-precious stones, which would add even more luster to the lives of the elite. In the early hours of the day, the artisan already had small stones on the table that glowed almost hypnotically.
The deep blue of the lapis lazuli recalled the star-studded night sky, while the turquoise had a vibrant hue, as if it were a piece of the crystallized Nile itself. Manipulating these stones was more than just beautifying. It was giving form to the sacred, as each color was believed to carry energy and protection. Today, when someone chooses to wear a quartz bracelet or an amethyst necklace, they are unwittingly repeating the same symbolic logic of the ancient Egyptians. The process was meticulous. The artisan polished each stone with repetitive movements until they achieved an intense shine. Then, with steady hands and attentive eyes, he inlaid them into rings, necklaces, or bracelets made of gold and silver. The soft sound of the tools and the tinkling of the metal fragments created a unique music within the workshop. Anyone who has worked with crafts knows there's an almost meditative state in losing oneself in these details, forgetting the passing of time. These jewels were not just aesthetic adornments, but amulet turquoise necklace could signify protection against illness, while lapis lazuli was associated with wisdom and spiritual connection. It's curious to think that even today, many people buy stones, believing in their energetic powers. The artisan, therefore, was not only a creator of beauty, he was also, in a sense, a guardian of the invisible, someone who shaped protection into art. There was also the social dimension. Wearing luxurious jewelry was a sign of status and power, something that distinguished the elite from the common people. A pharaoh covered in necklaces wasn't just adorned, he displayed his connection to the gods and his earthly superiority. The artisan, for his part, watched all this from a distance, aware that although he was the author of the brilliance, he wasn't part of it. It's like a musician who composes a hit song for another artist, but whose name is rarely remembered. And of course, the learning was passed down from generation to generation. The master showed the apprentice not only how to polish a stone, but also how to understand its meaning. This color protects, this one brings luck, this one calm. It was a knowledge that combined technique and spirituality, science and myth. Ultimately, perhaps the true value of jewelry lay not in the metal or the stone, but in the history they held. At the end of the day, when he saw his creations glow in the torchlight, the artisan knew he was dealing with symbols as powerful as they were beautiful. And it was precisely this blend of practical life and spirituality that was reflected in another part of his work. The small sculptures inspired by the simple daily lives of the people, yet charged with meaning. Upon waking, the artisan didn't just see the sunrise over the Nile, he saw stories: the woman grinding grain in her yard, the man fishing in the river, the children running barefoot in the sand. All of this became inspiration for his smaller sculptures. Unlike the grandiose works depicting gods or pharaohs, these small pieces captured the simplicity of everyday life. Today, when someone takes a spontaneous photo of a family lunch, they are, without realizing it, repeating this same desire to immortalize ordinary moments. In the workshop, the smell of clay mingled with that of freshly carved wood. There, the artisan molded figures depicting workers, musicians, or even domestic animals. The soft sound of his tools filled the space as he smiled at the memory of the scene he was recreating. It was as if to say, look, this is real life, not just the palaces. Perhaps that's why these small sculptures, when found in excavations, are so enchanting, because they reveal the humanity hidden behind Egyptian grandeur. These representations also had a practical purpose. Many were placed in tombs to ensure that the deceased would have access to the same services and pleasures as on earth in the afterlife. Imagine someone today being buried with miniature home appliances or a replica of their own cell phone. It sounds strange, but it's exactly what happened back then. The artisan, unknowingly, was creating a bridge between worlds. The curious thing is that these sculptures brought people closer to art. While the great temples were distant and untouchable, the small pieces could circulate more, found in homes, markets, and simple offerings. This somewhat democratized the artistic experience. It's like today, when someone buys a replica of a famous work instead of an original painting, beauty wasn't restricted to the elite. It also reached, in a modest way, everyday life. These smaller sculptures also demonstrated the artisan's sensitivity in capturing detail: the way a mother carried her child, the expression of a weary peasant, the movement of a musician playing the flute. These were simple gestures, but they brought the pieces to life. This attention is reminiscent of writers who transform ordinary scenes into poetry, showing that the extraordinary can be hidden in the ordinary. And at the end of the day, putting away these small figures, the artisan reflected on how ordinary life held as much dignity as perhaps, deep down, this blend of grandeur and simplicity was what kept Egyptian art alive, and it was precisely this essence that also revealed itself in another fundamental space of his practice: the collective workshops, where individual talent combined with the efforts of many. The artisan woke early, knowing his day wouldn't be lonely. Unlike poets or hermits, he shared his craft with dozens of other men in the collective workshop. The sound of multiple hammers, chisels, and saws created a peculiar symphony, almost like an improvised orchestra. There was no room for vanity. Each person played a part in the process, and only together could they deliver a work worthy of the pharaoh. Today, when we join a company or startup, the logic is not so different. Teams come together to transform ideas into reality. The workshops smelled of freshly broken stone, fresh wood, and human sweat. It was an intense environment where experienced masters and eager apprentices coexisted. The artisan knew that alone he would never be able to raise a colossal statue or polish an alabaster vase to perfection. It was the sum of hands, attentive eyes, and even shared mistakes that shaped the final result. This idea resonates to this day. No great project is sustainable without cooperation. Within this space, there was also a natural hierarchy. The elders gave instructions, while the younger ones learned by observing and repeating. There were no manuals or tutorials. Knowledge passed from mouth to mouth, from gesture to gesture. Imagine the patience required to wait years to master a technique without shortcuts or explanatory videos. This slowness, as harsh as it may seem, created depth, something we often lack in today's fast-paced world. The workshops were also places for socializing. Between one task and another, conversations, laughter, and stories would emerge. Perhaps someone would tell of a fishing trip on the Nile, another would complain about the heat, and yet another would dream of seeing their work recognized beyond borders. This camaraderie softened the weight of the routine. After all, sharing hardships makes the burden lighter. Anyone who has worked in a team knows how even inside jokes become fuel for facing long journeys. But there were tensions, disputes for recognition, silent rivalries, demands from the master who could punish severely. The craftsmen lived between cooperation and competition, a delicate balance we still see in any work group. It was necessary to learn not only how to carve wood or polish stone, but also how to deal with people, cultivating patience and respect. This was perhaps the most difficult art of all, and at the end of the day, when the noise of the tools ceased and only the silence of the night remained, the artisan realized that the collective workshops were much more than places of production. They were schools of life, where one learned about discipline, coexistence, and legacy. And this legacy was even more evident in the central figure who commanded everything, the master, a figure of authority and wisdom who guided the workshop's destiny. The artisan didn't work in an orderless space. On the contrary, each workshop had its own structure, almost like a small society. At the top was the master, a gray-haired man with a watchful eye whose experience was as weighty as the granite he shaped. He decided on projects, distributed tasks, and often served as the bridge between the workshop and the pharaoh's scribe. Today, he would be the equivalent of a company director, someone who bears responsibility for the whole. Below the master were the experienced artisans who had already mastered various techniques. They were respected, but still followed order. Their calloused hands were living proof of years of practice. They functioned as intermediate leaders, guiding assistants and correcting apprentices. It's similar to a team coordinator who still works on the front lines, but now bears the burden of teaching and supervising younger workers. Assistants played an essential role. They were often responsible for repetitive tasks, polishing surfaces, loading blocks, preparing tools. Although invisible in the glory of the work, without them, the process would not move forward. This detail is very reminiscent of modern work. Think of interns or assistants who rarely receive credit but maintain the foundation of any production. And then there were the apprentices, often young men who observed more than they did. They spent days simply sharpening tools or watching the master carve, absorbing every movement. Patience was a mandatory virtue. There were no shortcuts to mastery. It took time, discipline, and humility. This logic still applies today. Every expert was once a beginner who spent hours learning from small mistakes. Interestingly, this hierarchy was not only technical, but also social. The master had the strongest voice within the community, while apprentices and assistants occupied more discreet positions. Respect was cultivated from the top down, and breaking this order could mean expulsion from the workshop. This demonstrates how the craft was not just about manual skills, but also about collective discipline. As night fell, while the apprentices extinguished their torches and the assistants put away their tools, the master watched in silence. He knew this cycle would repeat itself for generations. Each apprentice would one day become a master, and it was precisely this transmission of knowledge, often kept secret, that ensured the continuity of Egyptian art. The craftsman woke up, knowing he carried not only the weight of his tools, but also that of treasured knowledge. The techniques he used were not written on papyrus, nor recorded in manual. They were whispered teachings, passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, almost like family secrets. Today, when someone learns an ancient recipe from their grandmother or a craft tradition from their father, they relive exactly this same logic of transmission. Inside the workshop, the apprentice observed in silence. He wasn't allowed to ask too many questions. He had to watch, repeat, and make mistakes until he learned. The master, in turn, revealed each detail little by little, as if testing the young man's patience and devotion. It's similar to teaching a cooking trick. He doesn't give all the tips at once, but lets the other discover part of the process on his own, further enhancing the value of the result. These secret techniques went far beyond how to do it. They also carried values: discipline, faith, patience. It was as if each stroke of the chisel held a hidden lesson. The apprentice wasn't just learning to carve a statue. He was learning to be part of something larger, to respect a tradition that had been going on for centuries. This shows how true learning is rarely just technical. It also shapes a way of life. Interestingly, this silence surrounding secrets also had a practical purpose. Keeping certain techniques restricted ensured that only a few could fully master the craft, protecting the profession's relevance. If everyone knew how to polish alabaster or set precious stones, the craftsman's value would plummet. It's the same thing we see today with professionals who guard their formulas for success, sharing only what's necessary to maintain their position. There was also an almost ritualistic aspect to this transmission. Many believed that revealing a secret without preparation could anger the gods or bring bad luck. This transformed the learning process into a kind of spiritual initiation. Imagine a father saying to his son, "Now you are ready to learn the cut that transforms stone into something eternal." This moment was not just technical, but symbolic, marking the passage to a new phase of life. And as night fell, and the apprentices extinguished their torches, the secrets remained hidden in their memories, alive only in the hands that knew how to repeat them. Secrets that the next day would be applied in temples and tombs, places considered sacred, where their artisan's art reached its grandest expression. When the artisan awoke, he already knew that day would be unlike any other. Working in a temple or a tomb wasn't just about fulfilling a task, it was about entering sacred territory. The scent of burning incense in the air, mixed with the deep sound of priests chanting, created a solemn atmosphere. Each stone touched seemed to carry an invisible weight, as if the very gaze of the gods were present. Today, when we enter a silent church or an ancient cemetery, we feel a hint of that same reverence. Tombs, especially those of the pharaohs, were seen as portals to eternity. The artisan who painted or carved their walls knew he wasn't just decorating, he was writing a man's story for the afterlife. Every detail, from the position of a figure to the choice of colors, had spiritual significance. It's as if someone today were compiling a diary not for themselves but for the gods to read. In the temples, the grandeur was impressive. Immense columns, colossal statues, walls covered in hieroglyphs. The craftsman, despite his humble position, participated in this spectacle of power and faith. It was a mixture of pride and anonymity, pride in contributing to something eternal, anonymity because his name would rarely be remembered. How often today do engineers and workers construct marvelous buildings without anyone knowing who actually laid each brick? The working environment in these places was rigorous. Priests supervised, ensuring that each image adhered to religious canon. A wrong stroke could be interpreted as an offense to the gods. The artisan then had to combine technique and devotion, obeying rules that went beyond aesthetics. It was like a musician who plays not just to please the audience, but to honor the sacred score of an invisible master. And there was also the emotional impact. Imagine spending weeks inside a dark tomb, lit only by torches, surrounded by funeral chants and symbols of death. This certainly left its mark on the artisan, who learned to live with the idea of finitude and transcend. Perhaps that's why many of them developed a profound respect for life, valuing even the simplest moments of everyday life. At the end of his journey, wiping the dust from his body in his calloused hands, the artisan carried with him the feeling of having participated in something greater than himself, and this perception became even more evident when he thought of the objects he created for these environments: amulets, statuettes, and offerings that would accompany the dead and ensure protection in the afterlife. Upon awakening, the artisan knew that some of his creations would never be seen by living eyes. Funeral objects had a specific purpose: to accompany the deceased on their journey to the afterlife. Scarab-shaped amulets, small statuettes of servants, containers filled with ointments, all held profound meaning. Today, when someone leaves flowers on a grave or a photo next to the deceased, they rekindle the same need to maintain a connection with those no longer here. Inside the workshop, the scent of the resin used to protect the pieces mingled with that of the clay and wood. The artisans fashioned amulets of hearts or protective eyes, believing each would act as a spiritual shield. It wasn't just manual labor, it was a kind of tangible spell. Anyone who has worn a scapular, a wedding ring, or even a lucky pendant knows these objects carry an emotional weight that goes beyond their material nature. The statuettes, known as oshaptas, represented servants who, according to belief, would perform tasks on the deceased's behalf in the afterlife. Imagine being buried with miniature helpers, as if they were promises that no one would need to work after death. Curious, isn't it? Today, in a different way, many wish to be remembered with letters, songs, or even digital messages, a kind of symbolic companionship that continues after their departure. The craftsman treated every detail with reverence. He knew these objects were not just ornaments, they were spiritual tools. He polished, painted, and carved with infinite patience,
believing the fate of the deceased could depend on the perfection of the piece. This responsibility carried as much weight as a signature on a modern contract. One mistake could compromise not only the work, but also someone's eternity. And there was also a social aspect. The wealthier the deceased, the more elaborate the objects that accompanied them. This revealed that inequality didn't end with death, it continued into the afterlife. The artisans saw this firsthand. While some had hundreds of statuettes in their tombs, others were content with one or two simple pieces. This difference still resonates today when we see luxurious cemeteries alongside humble graves. At the end of the day, looking at the small figures ready to embark on their journey into the unknown, the artisan realized that he was creating not only for the living, but also for the dead. And this idea of mass producing certain objects, multiplying symbols to accommodate so many tombs, paved the way for another fascinating practice: the use of molds to produce votive pieces on a larger scale. The artisan would awaken with a different feeling when he knew he would be working with molds. There it wasn't about creating a single unique piece, but about multiplying symbols, amulets, small figures of gods or sacred animals were mass-produced to meet popular demand.
Imagine how we buy keychains, religious souvenirs, or images of saints in stores today. Each person takes home the same object, but with a unique personal value. In the workshop, the process was meticulous. First, the master carefully created the original model. Then, clay or stone molds were used to replicate the form countless times. The smell of heated clay mingled with the heat of the fire, while the sound of hands pressing the material repeated like a mantra. This repetition, far from being tedious, had an almost meditative quality. Each copy was a silent prayer. These votive pieces were purchased by ordinary people who didn't have access to large, luxurious work. For them, a small amulet in the shape of an eye of Horus or a scarab beetle was enough to provide a sense of protection. This democratization of religious art is reminiscent of what we see today with affordable objects of faith: a small medallion of Saint Benedict, a simple rosary, a 7-day candle. The essence lies not in the price, but in the meaning. The curious thing is that even when mass-produced, these pieces never lost their symbolic value. Each one was consecrated, imbued with intention, and believed to possess the same spiritual power as a larger work. It's like today when someone buys a crucifix en masse. It doesn't matter if it's the same as thousands. What counts is the faith placed in it. For the artisan, this demonstrated that greatness lay not only in imposing temples, but also in the pockets of every common person. Furthermore, this practice allowed learners to become more involved in the process. Producing copies helped train inexperienced hands without compromising unique pieces. It was a practical school where repetition shaped not only the object, but also the student. This detail is very reminiscent of school calligraphy exercises, copying letters repeatedly until the hand becomes more comfortable. And when night fell and the small figures piled up in baskets, ready to be sold or offered in temples, the artisan realized that mass production also had its own meaning. After all, each copy would find a different destination, carrying faith in homes, altars, or tombs. And this same concern for repetition was reflected in another aspect of their lives: the rigidity with which they had to represent the gods and pharaohs, following patterns that could not be broken. From an early age, the artisan knew that working with images of gods and pharaohs wasn't just an artistic act, it was a mission steeped in rules. Every proportion, every gesture, every detail had to adhere to strict canon. The eye had to be seen head on, even if the face was in profile. The body followed exact measurements that symbolized perfection. There was no room for improvisation. Today, when we think of logos for major brands, we understand something similar. Standardization guarantees identity and power. In the workshop, the silence was greater these days. The sound of the tools seemed more restrained, as if even the hammer respected the solemnity of the task. The smell of paint made from ground minerals, the fine stone dust in the air, all contributed to the ritualistic atmosphere. The artisan felt he was facing something greater. He wasn't just drawing or sculpting, but obeying a cosmic order. It was as if his own hands were guided by ancient traditions. This rigor had a clear purpose, to show that the pharaoh was not only human, but also divine. Art served as a bridge between earthly and celestial power. The artisan knew that if he dared alter the proportions or invent poses, he would risk displeasing the priests and even jeopardizing his life. It's like a modern architect who can't arbitrarily change a listed historical project. Fidelity to the rules is part of respect. At the same time, there was a hidden lesson in this process. The artisan developed discipline, patience, and humility. He learned that beauty lay not only in unleashed creativity, but also in meticulous repetition. It's similar to classical musicians who have played the same scores for centuries. It may seem limiting, but within those boundaries, perfection is born. And even when following rigid standards, there was room for subtlety. The artisan could choose the intensity of a look, the softness of a line, the texture of a surface. Small differences that only a trained eye could perceive, but which carried their silent mark. It's as if to say, I respect the rule, but I still leave a fragment of myself here. And when the sun set, illuminating the walls filled with perfect, imposing figures, the artisan knew that his precision wasn't just technical, it was political, because depicting gods and pharaohs with such grandeur ultimately served to reinforce the authority and legitimacy of the ruling power. The artisan awakened to the awareness that his work was not neutral. Each piece he created, each image he molded, served a greater purpose, to legitimize the pharaoh's power. An immense statue, made to be seen from afar, was not merely decorative, it was a constant reminder of who. Today, when we see billboards or monuments of leaders in public squares, we understand this function well. Art as silent propaganda. In the workshops, the order was clear. The pharaoh must always appear imposing, eternal, almost superhuman. There was no room for wrinkles, flaws, or frailties. The body was idealized, the features perfect. The artisan knew that by sculpting a serene countenance, he was reinforcing the image of political stability. It's similar to official photos of presidents or CEOs in companies, carefully produced to convey confidence, but the influence went beyond aesthetics. Every decorated temple, every inlaid jewel, every carved vase bore the pharaoh's name or symbol. The people, upon entering these spaces, felt the weight of his authority. It was a subtle way of shaping the collective mindset. If everything around reflected the pharaoh's greatness, then he must truly be an envoy of the gods. Today, brands do something similar, stamping logos everywhere to reinforce their presence and dominance. The craftsman often noticed this cog. He knew it was just a cog in a larger machine. And at the same time, he felt a kind of quiet pride. Even without governing, he contributed to maintaining order in the kingdom. This ambiguity is common to this day. How many people work on grand corporate or government projects without ever seeing their name recognized, yet knowing that their efforts sustain the whole? It's interesting to note that religion itself was intertwined with this process. By portraying the pharaoh as divine,
Art confirmed the idea that disobeying the ruler was tantamount to disrespecting the gods. This transformed each sculpture into a political act. The artisan, even though he had no public voice, spoke through his work, and his message was clear: power is eternal. And when the day drew to a close, the artisan would wipe his calloused hands and gaze upon his finished work. He knew that this piece was not only beautiful, but strategic, and silently he reflected on another, equally important aspect of his art: how trade caused these objects to cross borders, spreading Egypt's image and influence beyond its homeland. From an early age, the artisan was aware that his creations didn't stop in the workshop, and a piece's destiny was to cross borders, travel through the desert in caravans, or glide down the Nile in laden boats. Internal and external trade meant his works reached far-flung places, becoming not only luxury objects, but also symbols of Egypt's power and wealth. Today, when a handmade product is sold online and reaches another country, the feeling is similar. The work gains a life beyond the hands that created it. At local markets, it was common to see vases, jewelry, and small statues vying for attention among spices, fabrics, and food.
The scent of incense mingled with the noise of merchants, and luxury objects stood out as rare treasures. The artisan knew that, for many buyers, it wasn't just about acquiring a beautiful piece, but about taking home a piece of Egyptian prestige. It's like today when someone buys a designer handbag. More than the object, it's the brand that speaks. Foreign trade further amplified this impact. Turquoise jewelry, alabaster vases, and embroidered fabrics traveled to neighboring lands, reaching people in Mesopotamia and even beyond. The artisan may never have left his village, but his work crossed borders. This detail reminds us of how many workers today produce pieces for export without ever knowing their final destination. The world has always been more connected than we imagine. This movement also generated wealth for the state. The taxes levied on these exchanges fed the royal coffers, enabling new construction and wars of expansion. In other words, artisans worked not only for luxury goods, but also for the economic engine of the empire. This logic still repeats itself. Every product we export or import strengthens entire chains of power and dependence. Interestingly, this trade also transformed the perception of art. Objects created with a spiritual function in Egypt, when they reached other peoples, were often seen only as exotic and valuable pieces. This demonstrates how the meaning of a work can change depending on the recipient's perspective. To this day, we see this when a cultural item is exported and reinterpreted differently in another country. And as night fell, the artisan reflected on how his anonymous hands were, in a way, present in lands he would never set foot in. This thought filled him with pride, but also with questions. What made a piece so coveted, so valuable? Perhaps it had to do with symmetry and proportion, elements that gave Egyptian sculptures and objects an irresistible harmony. Upon awakening, the artisan already knew that it wasn't enough to simply sculpt. He had to obey the invisible rules of symmetry and proportion. Every line, every curve should reflect balance. For the Egyptians, harmony was not just aesthetic, but spiritual. They believed that the balance of forms reflected the balance of the universe itself. Today, when we look at modern buildings or perfectly aligned logos, we feel the same silent attraction to symmetry. In the workshop, the artisan used ropes, rudimentary rulers, and even marks in the sand to calculate measurements. The rhythmic sound of the tools seemed to accompany this sense of order. There was no room for uncontrolled improvisation. A slightly larger arm, a misaligned face, and the entire work lost its symbolic power. This rigor is similar to what we see in engineers or architects, who know that one wrong centimeter can compromise an entire structure. Symmetry also conveyed power. A perfectly balanced statue conveyed the idea of stability, as if to say, the pharaoh is eternal, nothing can shake him. Standardized proportions, meanwhile, avoided revealing human frailty. This idealization is very reminiscent of what we do today with edited photos on social media. We present perfect versions that hide everyday imperfections. But there was something deeper. The artisan learned that, in life, as in sculpture, excess on one side unbalances the whole. This teaching transcended the workshop. How often today do we feel disproportionate, dedicating too much to work and forgetting about family, or caring only for the body and neglecting the mind? Egyptian art already reminded us the secret lies in balance. When teaching his apprentices, the master would say, "Look at nature, the human body, the leaves, the river, everything has proportion." Thus they understood that art imitated not only the social order, but also the natural order. It's the same principle we see in the mathematics of the golden ratio, celebrated to this day as a sign of aesthetic perfection. And when night fell, and the artisan gazed upon the finished statue, he saw before him not just an object, but a reflection of the cosmos in stone. This search for balance and beauty, so central to Egypt, would ultimately influence the very concept of aesthetics for centuries. And it was precisely at this point that artisanal art became a pillar of cultural development. The artisan woke up without realizing that, by repeating his daily gestures, he was helping to build something much greater, the aesthetic identity of an entire people. Every detail of his sculptures, jewelry, and vases defined standards that would be followed for centuries. Egyptian aesthetics, with their grandeur and symbolism, were not born by chance, but by the disciplined hands of thousands of artisans. It's curious to think that today, we still immediately recognize an Egyptian trait, even without having lived in that era. Inside the workshop, careful attention to proportions, respect for symmetry, and the use of specific colors became routine. But this routine, repeated for generations, cemented an unmistakable style. Red represented vitality, blue represented the divine, gold represented eternity. All of this formed a palette that not only pleased the eye, but also carried symbolic messages. Just as today, when we associate certain colors with brands or feelings, Egypt already mastered this visual language. The impact of artisanal art went beyond temples and tombs. It was present in everyday objects, personal adornments, and small figurines that accompanied people in their everyday lives. This blend of luxury and simplicity created a sense of collective aesthetics, shared by all social classes. It's like today, when we see sophisticated design in both monumental buildings and well-designed household objects. At the same time, Egyptian aesthetics influenced how people perceived the world. The eye trained to recognize symmetry, harmony, and proportion also shaped the people's sense of beauty. The artisan, without realizing it, educated entire generations to admire certain patterns. This influence is reminiscent of how, today, fashion and advertising dictate trends that shape the collective view of what is beautiful. The apprentices themselves, growing up within this aesthetic environment, learned that beauty was not just adornment, it was language, it was power. Each object carried a silent discourse about order, divinity, and permanence. Thus, the artisan's handiwork became a visual philosophy, cementing aesthetics as part of Egyptian national identity. And when the sun set and the torches illuminated the walls filled with rigid, imposing figures, the artisan realized he was part of something eternal, an aesthetic that was not just his, but that of an entire people sustained by their collective memory. And this memory would gain a special place in communities like Deir or El Medina, where artisans lived dedicated to serving the pharaohs exclusively,
When the craftsman awoke in Deir el Medina, I knew I lived in a different place. This wasn't just any village, but an entire community made up entirely of artisans and their families, created to serve the pharaohs in the construction and decoration of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Imagine a modern neighborhood planned solely for engineers and artists, all focused on the same purpose, to build the eternal memory of their rulers. Everyday life there had distinctive sounds and smell. Hammers echoed against stone, chisels scratched surfaces, voices discussed measurements, while the smell of mineral dust and fresh bread from the houses mingled. Each resident had their own role, some sculpted, others painted, others carved inscriptions. It was a living organism, where each part contributed to keeping the work cycle going. This special community offered rare benefits. Artisans received housing, payment in grain, clothing, and even a measure of social stability. They weren't nobles, but they enjoyed a privileged position compared to peasants. It was like working for a modern company that provided housing, transportation, and schooling for the family, a bubble of relative security within an uncertain world. However, there were also 10 strikes were reported in Deir el Medina when payments were late, one of the first documented labor movements in history. This shows that even in such an exclusive place, artisans knew how to demand their right. It's interesting to note how this collective consciousness still resonates today in protests and unions advocating for fair working conditions. Beyond the social aspect, there was community life. Families knew each other, shared meals, and celebrated religious festivals together. Apprentices grew up observing their parents' work, breathing in the atmosphere of art from a young age. This created an almost inevitable continuity. Those born in Deir el Medina had a good chance of following the same path. And as night fell over the village, the artisans chatted in front of their houses, gazing at the stars that seemed to watch over the desert. They knew their lives were intertwined with those of the pharaohs, but they also bore the burden of depending on a system that could fail. And it is precisely in this dependence that another delicate point arises: the difficulties faced by artisans who lacked direct support from the elite. When the common artisan woke up, far from the walls of special communities like Deir el Medina, the reality was quite different. Without the patronage of pharaohs or nobles, he had to toil daily to secure a living. His hands were the same, skillful, but the destination of his creations was different. Simple markets, bartering for food, modest sale. He was like a contemporary artist who, without renowned galleries, exhibits his works in street fairs. In the makeshift workshop, the smell was of damp clay and cheap wood, not gold or alabaster. The tools were worn, often reused, and the pace of work was dictated by necessity, not lavish contracts. The sound of the hammer still echoed, but now as an effort to survive, not as part of a grand government project. This contrast recalls the difference between those who work for a multinational corporation and those who depend on their own small business.
The biggest challenge was instability. Some days there were orders, others there weren't. The artisan needed to create affordable pieces that people could buy: small amulets, simple containers, unadorned figurines. No luxury, no ostentation. It was living on the edge, balancing talent with the practical needs of the day. Today, many freelancers live this same reality. Months of intense work, followed by weeks of uncertainty. There was also social weight. Without patronage, artisans had less prestige, less voice. They didn't participate in major projects. Their names weren't inscribed on documents. Their work, though useful, was seen as commonplace. And yet, their contribution was essential. These simple pieces circulated in everyday life, keeping the people's connection with religion and culture alive. It's like today. Not every artist is famous, but they all nourish the cultural life of a society. Learning in these cases was also more limited. Without access to elite masters, many artisans learned only by observing or improvising. This produced less refined results, but paradoxically, freer ones. After all, without the obligation to follow rigid standards, there was room for experimentation. This freedom often produced more authentic pieces, imbued with personal traits, and when the day ended, the unsponsored artisan looked at his calloused hands and felt both pride and frustration. Pride in creating something that circulated among the people, frustration at not being remembered by history. Perhaps this is why some tried to record their activities on house walls or small scrolls, leaving discreet traces of their existence. Upon awakening, the artisan rarely imagined that anyone would remember him in the future. Yet, in certain places, his work wasn't limited to the pieces he created. There were also records of his daily routine. Papyri detailed payments, strikes, and lists of workers. Tomb walls showed scenes of workshops, men carving, painting, and carrying blocks. It was as if, without realizing it, they were writing a collective diary. Today, when we use social media to share our daily lives, we follow the same instinct, to leave a trace. In the dim light of the tombs, lit only by torches, images of artisans hunched over their tasks emerged. The smell of mineral paint and the dust of the stones created a heavy yet meaningful atmosphere. These paintings weren't just decoration, they were testimonies. They said, "We too exist. We are the ones who shaped this world." How often today does someone discreetly sign a project or leave a hidden mark just to prove they were there? The papyri in turn revealed practical details, notes on delayed wages, material orders, family records. These seemingly banal documents are now treasures for archaeologists. They show that artisans were not just anonymous hands, but people with concerns, achievements, and complaints. It's like when in the future someone finds emails from workers reporting delays or difficult conditions, small stories that reveal real life. These records also served as protection against oblivion. In a society obsessed with eternity, leaving one's name written, even on a payroll, was a way to survive. The artisan knew that his works would carry the glory of the pharaohs, but the records would carry his own memory. A hidden signature, a trace on the papyrus, was his way of saying, "I was part of this too." It's curious how this need still pulsates within us. How many artists write dedications on their works? How many workers leave messages on building walls? How many teachers sign students' notebooks? These are small gestures, but loaded with symbolism. The Egyptian artisan, even without realizing it, was already teaching this, the importance of making a presence felt, no matter how small. And at the end of the day, as he gazed at the wall depicting scenes from his own workshop, he might smile. After all, it wasn't just the pharaoh whose story would be told. The craftsman also left his mark, and these marks, often linked to religious and political ceremonies, played a crucial role in the life of Egypt. The artisan would wake up knowing that day his hands would shape something that would not be just an object, but part of a ritual. Each handcrafted piece had a function beyond aesthetics. It was an instrument of ceremonies that united faith and power. An alabaster chalice could be used to offer wine to the gods. A golden statue could be carried in procession. It was as if his creations had gained a voice of their own, speaking in the place of the people before the gods and rulers. Inside the temples, the scent of incense mingled with the sound of chanting and drumming. There, their objects came to life. A simple amulet, which seemed ordinary in the workshop, became sacred when placed on the altar. This transformation was reminiscent of what happens today. When a simple ring becomes a wedding band, the material is the same, but the meaning changes completely. The artisan understood that his work was also at the heart of political ceremonies. Luxurious gifts, richly decorated vases, or impressive jewelry were used diplomatically, offered to allies or to impress enemies. Imagine a current ruler gifting another with a rare work of art. It's not just courtesy, but strategy. Egypt understood this play on symbols well. These objects also served as bridges between the people and those in power. When a statue of a god was displayed in a procession, the people were moved, believing they were participating in something divine. The artisan, though absent, was there, invisible, sustaining the spectacle with his creation. How many professionals today are behind the scenes at major events, responsible for effects that enchant crowds without anyone knowing their names? It was a job that combined pride and responsibility. The artisan knew that if he made a mistake, he would fail not only his master or the pharaoh, but also the gods. This spiritual charge transformed every detail into an act of devotion. It's like a chef preparing a banquet for a unique occasion. The dish is not just food, it's a symbol of unity, respect, and power. And when the day ended, the pieces were taken to the temple or palace, ready to be part of rituals that would draw crowds. The artisan, from afar, might hear the drums and feel a shiver. His work was now part of something collective, greater than himself. And amid this constant exchange of symbols, external influences also emerged, as Egypt absorbed ideas and styles from other peoples through cultural contact. When the artisan woke up and walked to his workshop, he might not have immediately realized that many of the techniques he used did not originate solely in Egypt. Contact with other civilizations brought new things, stones from far away, foreign styles, different ideas of adornment and form. Trade and war served as cultural bridges. Today, when we wear Italian clothes, eat Japanese food, and listen to American music, we are repeating this same exchange. In the markets, the scent of spices from the East mingled with the scent of local fruit. Among colorful fabrics and rare metals, stones like lapis lazuli, imported from Afghanistan, also arrived. The artisan, polishing this gem, perhaps never imagined the long journey it had traveled. This detail shows how, even living in simple villages, he participated in a globalized world in his own way. Influences also came in the form of style. Certain carving techniques, decorative patterns, and even furniture shapes displayed foreign traits. The artisan learned by observing objects brought from abroad, adapting them to Egyptian tastes. It's like a modern chef blending spices from different cultures to create a new recipe, tradition, and innovation working together. This cultural exchange enriched local aesthetics, but also reinforced Egypt's power. By absorbing and mastering foreign techniques, artisans demonstrated that the empire not only received influences, but also transformed them. Thus, Egypt became a benchmark. Similarly, today, countries that dominate technology not only consume, but also set trends. It's curious to note that even in a time without the internet or airplanes, the circulation of ideas was intense. Foreign objects were reinterpreted, mixed with Egyptian symbols, creating fascinating hybrids. The artisan, in this process, was both a guardian of tradition and an agent of innovation. This balance between maintaining what is original and embracing the new remains a challenge for artists and professionals to this day. And at the end of the day, wiping the dust from his hands, the artisan reflected on how what came from outside also shaped his identity. But as much as there was room for influence, there were limits. Egyptian canons imposed creative restrictions, ensuring that art did not lose its essence. The artisan woke up every day
knowing that his imagination had well-defined boundaries. In Egypt, art was not a territory for free improvisation. It was governed by rigid canons that determined proportions, postures, and even colors. Depicting a pharaoh in a way that deviated from the norm wasn't artistic daring, it was disrespectful. Today, when we think of visual identity manuals that prohibit changing logos or brand colors, we see a reflection of this same rigidity. Within the workshop, this translated into almost military discipline. The master vigilantly monitored that no one escaped the rule. One arm could not be longer than the other. A face could not smile too much. A color could not be applied outside its symbolism. The smell of mineral paint, the repetitive sound of chisels, and the exhaustive repetition were routine. The artisan did not create for himself, but to perpetuate a cosmic and political order. This creative limitation had a purpose: to reinforce stability. By repeating the same aesthetic for centuries, Egypt conveyed to the people the idea of continuity, that nothing changed, that power was eternal. It's similar to governments or companies that avoid sudden changes so as not to undermine public confidence. Art was therefore a strategy for permanence, but despite the restrictions, the craftsmen found loopholes: small detail in the look, a softer line, a different texture. These were discrete ways of expressing something personal without breaking the rule. This balance between obedience and creativity is reminiscent of classical musicians, who, even playing the same score over and over, managed to add a unique touch to their interpretation. For the apprentice, this rigidity was a test of character. Anyone who couldn't stand repetition would never become a master. The craft taught that freedom didn't lie in inventing anything, but in mastering to perfection what already existed. It's a lesson that still resonates today. Before breaking the rules, you must know them thoroughly. And when night fell, the artisan would look at the walls covered in similar, almost identical figures and notice something curious. Although they looked the same, they were different. Small, almost invisible variations revealed their presence. And it was precisely this quest for permanence that ensured that many of these works survived, preserved to this day in museums. When the artisan woke up and resumed his chiseling routine, he perhaps never imagined that what he created would endure for millennia. But Egyptian pieces had something special. They were made to last. Granite, basalt, gold, and even alabaster were chosen not only for their beauty, but also for their durability. Today, when we visit a museum and see a statue over 3,000 years old, we feel almost the same awe that the artisan would feel upon discovering that his work has survived so long. In the workshop, the secret lay in the tireless polishing, the precise fitting, the bonding with natural resins. Every detail was designed to withstand time, heat, dust, and even water. The smell of sun-warmed stone, the steady sound of hammers, all were part of a choreography of patience that ensured the object's immortality. It's similar to modern constructions built to endure centuries, like cathedrals or bridges. This durability also had symbolic meaning. The works were made for eternity, not for passing fashion. The artisan knew that his funerary objects, for example, should accompany the deceased forever. It was an immense responsibility. Today, when someone records a video or writes a book hoping it will last beyond their lifetime, they relive that same desire for permanence. The longevity of the pieces also demonstrates the wisdom in choosing the material. Gold doesn't rust, granite doesn't wear easily, basalt withstands even extreme climate changes. The craftsman, without modern science, already understood empirically which resources would guarantee solution.
This reminds us that often the most valuable knowledge comes not from theories, but from the patient observation of nature. Interestingly, Durability also brought posthumous fame. Many artisans' names were never remembered during their lifetime, but their creations are now in museums around the world, admired by millions. It's a kind of ironic immortality. The creator has been forgotten, but their work endures. This is repeated in modern times when we see songs or inventions surviving even without knowing who created them. And at the end of the day, the craftsman may have had no idea that that vase, that statue, or that amulet would still exist thousands of years later. But his patience and discipline became testaments to eternity, and it is precisely thanks to this preservation that modern archaeologists are able to unravel the techniques and tools used by these men of the past. The artisan in his time could never have imagined that thousands of years later strangely dressed foreign men would excavate his workshops. Yet that's exactly what happened. Archaeological excavations have revealed pieces of chisels, reed brushes, stone palettes with traces of pigment, and even entire preserved workshops. Today, visiting these finds is like opening a window in time. You can almost hear the sound of tools being used again. Among the rubble, archaeologists also found papyrus records describing material lists, work schedules, and even complaints about late payments. These fragments allow us to reconstruct not only the technique, but also daily life. It's like finding an ancient notebook full of trivial notes that centuries later become a precious source of knowledge. The tools revealed were simple, yet incredibly effective. Copper chisels, stone hammers, saws made with abrasive sand. The artisan lacked modern machinery, but he made up for it with ingenuity. This shows us that true mastery depends not solely on technology, but on human skill in extracting the most from limited resources. Consider how many artists today create magnificent works with only paper and pencil. Studying these discoveries also revealed details about the pigments. Fragments of palettes revealed that colors were made with minerals such as malachite, ochre, and lapis lazuli. Each hue had a specific symbolism and function. When observing these palettes, archaeologists practically see a modern painter's palette, still stained with paint, frozen in time. It's as if the artisan had gone off to rest and never returned. These discoveries are not just academic curiosity. They inspire artists, restorers, and even modern tool makers. Many attempt to recreate these ancient techniques, proving that we can still learn from the patience and ingenuity of the Egyptians. The past, therefore, remains the silent master of the present, and at the end of the day, when archaeologists close their excavations and take fragments to museums, the artisan's legacy is revived. Their tools and techniques, once hidden, now gain new light. And this contrast between popular and luxurious objects, between what was made for the common people and what was reserved for the nobility, becomes even clearer to us. The artisan would wake up knowing exactly who he would be working for that day. If the commission came from the common people, the result would be simple, unadorned clay vases, small wooden figurines, cheap amulets. When the elite commissioned, the materials varied: gold, silver, rare stones, and alabaster. This difference was not just aesthetic, but social. Today, when we see someone wearing diamond jewelry while another wears costume jewelry, we are faced with the same logic of distinction. In the workshop, the contrast was evident. For the common people, the tools were basic, the finishes more rustic, and the time required was less. For the nobility, the work stretched over weeks, even months, with extreme attention to detail. The scent of simple wood and popular clay alternated with the shine of precious metals, and the perfume of expensive resins used in luxurious pieces. It was as if the artisan lived in two different worlds within the same space. Popular objects had a direct practical and spiritual function to protect, serve, and accompany daily life. They were accessible and connected to everyday life. In contrast, luxury objects were not merely utilitarian, but symbols of power, status, and eternity. This duality is the same we see today when someone buys a basic cell phone for daily use, while another acquires the more expensive version as a status symbol. Interestingly, artisans often preferred the simplicity of popular pieces. There was more freedom, less pressure for rigid perfection. In luxury pieces, however, every detail was measured and supervised, with the weight of the pharaoh's prestige at stake. This situation is reminiscent of modern professionals who say they find more pleasure in personal projects, free from rules, than in large contracts that demand absolute perfection. Still, it was luxury that guaranteed the workshop's prestige and survival. A craftsman who satisfied the elite could earn rewards, better conditions, and even social protection. Popular objects paid the bills, but it was the luxurious pieces that opened doors. The balance between the two was what sustained their livelihood. And at the end of the day, the artisan reflected on this inequality. Some had the minimum, others the excess, but in the end, everyone depended on his hand. And perhaps it was this balance between simplicity and ostentation that, in a way, defined the legacy of Egyptian artisans, a legacy that still influences the history of art itself. The artisan woke up without imagining that, millennia later, his hands would still be remembered. His legacy was not limited to the banks of the Nile. It spanned deserts, seas, and centuries, influencing entire cultures. Egyptian aesthetics, with their pursuit of symmetry, eternity, and symbolism, shaped the way other civilizations conceived of art. Today, when we see columns in buildings or monumental statues in squares, we still feel echoes of that tradition. In the workshop, each chisel stroke seemed mundane, but together they built a style that taught the world that art can be more than decoration. It can be religion, politics, and identity all at once. This vision inspired the Greeks, Romans, and centuries later, even modern movements. It's as if the craftsmen in silence had left lessons that have spanned generations. The legacy also lies in the technique. Their mastery of stone, metal, wood, and jewelry was not only impressive at the time, but became a benchmark of perfection. Museums around the world now display their creations, and millions marvel at the precision of every detail. It's as if the artisan's hands are still working before our eyes. But perhaps their greatest legacy is not material, but symbolic. Egyptian artisans demonstrated that human labor can touch the divine, that patience can transform stone into eternity, that discipline can span the centuries. This is a lesson that still inspires artists, architects, and dreamers of all. Interestingly, this legacy isn't exclusive to the elite. Even simple popular objects bear proof that art can emerge from the everyday and achieve the extraordinary. Ordinary life transformed into sculpture, faith transformed into amulet, all of this has also survived. This detail reminds us that in art there is no absolute hierarchy. Every gesture can be eternal. And as night fell over the workshop, the artisan could never have predicted that his work would travel so far through time. Today, as we contemplate his pieces in museums, we become part of this invisible chain connecting past and present, and it is precisely here that our journey ends. We have explored the lives, hardships, and genius of these men. But before we close, it's time to take a step back and consider how to present this entire story in an engaging way, to open our video with impact. And now I ask you, after learning about the lives of these artisans, how do you view your own work? Are you simply fulfilling tasks, or are you leaving marks that can stand the test of time? Perhaps the difference between the ordinary and the eternal lies precisely in the details you put into each day of your life. If these men without technology managed to create works that lasted millennia, what can you build today with the tools you have at your disposal? Think about it. Are you investing your energy in what truly matters, or wasting your talent on fleeting things? I want you to reflect. If someone in the future had access to what you produce, would they feel proud or indifferent? This question may be uncomfortable, but it's precisely this discomfort that generates change. So tell me in the comments, what detail about these artisans' stories resonated with you most? Was it their discipline, their patience, their faith in their work, or their pursuit of eternity? I'd love to hear your perspective, because each answer is a piece that completes this great puzzle. And of course, if this video was valuable to you, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. This way, you'll continue learning stories that not only inform, but transform the way you see the world, and perhaps even the way you live your daily life.